The fiesta was over. Once again, the townspeople realized, just like every year, that their treasury was emptier, their muscles ached from working, and their heads throbbed from the sleepless nights. Despite the long hours and efforts, they didn't have as much fun as they hoped. They hadn't made any new friends, and nothing seemed to have changed. But this didn't bother them. Next year they would do it all again, just as they had always done. It was their tradition, after all. However, in Capitan Tiago's grand house, a heavy sadness hung in the air. The windows were shut tightly, the usually lively home now quiet. Even the servants, who were often chatty in the kitchen, spoke in whispers. The reason for the gloomy atmosphere? Maria Clara, the heart and soul of the house, lay bedridden, gravely ill. Her condition was evident on the faces of everyone around, especially Capitan Tiago, whose usually energetic demeanor had vanished. His worry seemed to age him. "Isabel," Tiago muttered, pacing near his sister-in-law, Aunt Isabel. "Which cross should I make a poor offering to? The cross of Tunasan or the cross of Matahong?" His voice trembled with anxiety. "The Tunasan cross grows, while the Matahong cross sweats. Which one is more miraculous, do you think?" Aunt Isabel pondered for a moment. She adjusted her spectacles and replied, "To grow. To grow is a greater miracle, brother. Anyone can sweat, but not everyone can grow, especially not a cross made of wood." "You're right, Isabel," Capitan Tiago sighed. "But then again, isn't it miraculous for a piece of wood, the same kind used for furniture, to sweat like a person? It might be safer to make offerings to both crosses, don't you think? This way, we don't upset either of them, and Maria might get better sooner." His face brightened a bit, as if he had found some hope. "Are the rooms ready?" he asked urgently. "The doctors are coming soon, and with them a new gentleman, a relative of Padre Damaso, no less. We must make sure nothing is lacking. Everything must be perfect." Meanwhile, in a different part of the house, Maria Clara's cousins, Sinang and Victoria, sat near her bedroom. They were helping Andeng, Maria Clara's childhood friend, polish a set of silver teacups. The three girls whispered softly to pass the time. "Do you know anything about this Dr. Espadaña who's coming?" Andeng asked curiously, wiping a silver spoon with a soft cloth. Victoria shook her head, her brow furrowing. "Not much, except what Capitan Tiago mentioned. He charges high fees." "If he charges a lot," Sinang chimed in, "he must be a good doctor." She gave a sly smile, only half serious. Andeng nodded eagerly. "Exactly. The doctor who operated on Doña Maria last year charged a fortune, and he was said to be very skilled." Sinang smirked and waved her hand dismissively. "Just because someone charges a lot doesn't mean they're good. Look at Dr. Guevara. He did a terrible job on that poor woman. Both she and her child died because of his mistakes. Then he charged her husband 50 pesos. Victoria gasped. "That's awful." "I know. The poor man had to sell his house to pay the fee. The alcalde helped the doctor too, so he had no choice. My father even lent him money to travel to Santa Cruz. So no, just charging a lot doesn't make someone a good doctor." Sinang finished her tale with a firm nod, confident in her wisdom. Their conversation was cut short by the sound of horses and a carriage arriving in front of the house. Capitan Tiago and Aunt Isabel hurried down the stairs to greet their guests. Dr. Don Tiburcio de Espadaña, his wife Doña Victorina de los Reyes de Espadaña, and a young man with a pleasant face, Don Alfonso Linares de Espadaña, who was introduced as a distant relative of Padre Damaso. Doña Victorina strutted in first, wearing a silk dress embroidered with bright flowers. A large flamboyant hat sat on her head, decorated with a crushed parrot nestled between red and blue ribbons. Her face, thickly coated in rice powder, was streaked with sweat and dust from the journey, making her look even older than her years. She proudly held the arm of her husband, Dr. Tiburcio, a man whose limp and frail appearance made him seem much older than his 35 years. His thin frame and balding head only added to the image of a man who had seen better days. As the group made their way inside, Doña Victorina spoke up, her voice loud and commanding. "Allow me to introduce our dear cousin, Don Alfonso Linares de Espadaña. He's a godson of Padre Damaso's family, and has served as a private secretary to all the ministers in Spain. The young Spaniard smiled politely and bowed. Capitan Tiago, filled with a mix of admiration and anxiety, almost kissed the young man's hand in respect. He quickly led them into the house, instructing the servants to take care of the luggage and prepare the rooms. As they moved upstairs, let us take a moment to learn more about this peculiar couple. Dr. Tiburcio and Doña Victorina. Doña Victorina was a woman of 45 years, though she often claimed to be only 32. In her youth, she had been beautiful, at least by her own standards, and had many Filipino admirers. However, she had always aspired to marry a Spaniard. She had turned down countless suitors, dreaming of a husband from another race, someone who could elevate her status in society. Her dream, however, had taken far too long to come true. When she was finally married 6 months earlier, she had already lost much of her youthful beauty. Her hair, once thick and flowing, had thinned considerably. Her face was wrinkled, and she had resorted to wearing false teeth and using an overwhelming amount of rice powder to hide the signs of aging. Dr. Tiburcio, on the other hand, had not lived an easy life. He arrived in the Philippines as a petty official, but a string of misfortunes had left him penniless and unemployed. He was not highly educated, having only briefly worked in a hospital as an attendant where his main task was to sweep floors and light fires. Desperate to survive, he had been convinced by his fellow Spaniards to pose as a doctor in the provinces. At first he charged reasonable fees, but as word of his medical practice spread, he raised his prices. Unfortunately, the authorities in Manila eventually caught wind of his scam, and he was forced to stop practicing. It was at this low point in his life that Tiburcio was introduced to Doña Victorina. Despite her age and domineering personality, she represented a chance for him to escape poverty. Tiburcio was a kind-hearted man, incapable of malice or resentment. He accepted his fate and married her, resigning himself to a life of quiet submission. Doña Victorina, for her part, believed that by marrying a Spaniard, she had finally fulfilled her life's ambition. Their marriage was far from ideal. Doña Victorina was bossy and vain, while Tiburcio was passive and often too timid to stand up to her. She insisted on buying him a new set of false teeth, new clothes, and even carriages with expensive ponies. She forced him to ride in public, though he preferred to stay at home to avoid showing off his limp. Still, she controlled everything he did, down to how he dressed and where he went. One evening, Tiburcio timidly brought up the subject of her excessive use of rice powder. My dear," he stammered, "I think you might look better with less powder." Doña Victorina raised an eyebrow and glared at him. "I don't care what you think, Tiburcio," she said sharply, tugging at the frizzy hairpiece she wore. "The powder stays." Tiburcio sighed and quickly dropped the subject. He knew better than to argue. In time, Doña Victorina grew even more ridiculous. She added an extra "de" to her surname and insisted that all her acquaintances address her as doctora. She even forced Tiburcio to adopt the title of doctor officially, though he no longer practiced medicine. One of her greatest fantasies was to give birth to a child. For months, she convinced herself that she was pregnant and even announced plans to travel to Spain so that her child wouldn't be born in the Philippines. "I won't have my son growing up to be called a revolutionist," she declared proudly. But the months passed, and when it became clear that she wasn't expecting, she was forced to abandon the dream. Despite these disappointments, Doña Victorina continued to dominate her husband's life. She often pulled out his false teeth when she was angry with him, leaving him toothless and humiliated for days. Capitan Tiago had heard many stories about the Espadañas, but out of respect for their titles, he still invited them to his home. Besides, Tiburcio was the only doctor available who had agreed to come to their remote village. But it wasn't the Espadañas that excited him the most. It was Don Alfonso Linares, a connection to Padre Damaso and the Spanish ruling class. In his mind, this visit could be the key to bringing back Maria Clara's health and improving his own standing in society. As Capitan Tiago ushered his guests to the parlor, Doña Victorina wasted no time making herself comfortable. "I expect nothing but the finest service," she announced as she sat down, smoothing out her silk dress. "And don't forget, Tiburcio is a doctor. He should be treated with the utmost respect." Don Tiburcio nodded weakly, unable to muster a response. He knew his wife would do all the talking, and that suited him just fine. As they settled in, Doña Victorina continued to boast about her husband's achievements, her loud voice filling the room. "He has performed surgeries that not even the best doctors in Manila would dare attempt." Meanwhile, Don Alfonso Linares sat quietly, smiling politely and occasionally nodding in agreement. He was young, ambitious, and eager to make a name for himself, especially with the backing of influential figures like Padre Damaso. He had been promised that his future was bright in the Philippines, and he was determined to succeed. As they all chatted in the parlor, Capitan Tiago felt a renewed sense of hope. Perhaps with these new guests in his home, Maria Clara's health would improve, and his connections to the Spanish elite would solidify.